He called up and he said, I really wish you luck and everything, but no, there's no upside to this for us.
Musician Mike Post, who gave us, of course, the Rockford Files, Hill Street Blues, so many great themes for TV shows, was one of drummer Jim Gordon's best friends. He tried to help him. Jill Gordon was Jim Gordon's ex-wife. They were not together when Jim took his mother's life. Amy is Jim Gordon's daughter. That tragic event when Jim attacked his mother, took away Jill's grandmother, she was only 14 at the time, had major impacts, not only in music, but for them personally. At first, they didn't want to be involved in the book at all, which is called Drums and Demons by Joel Selvin. But then Jim passed away, March 13th, 2023. Let's talk about the impact that Jim Gordon had on not only us, but those three people who were the closest to him. On Rock History Music with Joel Selvin. Jim Gordon was a professional drummer, born July 14, 1945. He was famous for being a very popular session musician and was known as a protege to drumming legend Hal Blaine. He played on some classic albums, like the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. He was in studio with Paul Revere and the Raiders, as well as the Byrds and Judy Collins, and Frank Zappa. In 1970, he was part of Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour. He also toured with Traffic and was on 2 of their albums, including Low Spark of High Heel Boys. He was featured on Harry Nilsson's famous Nilsson Schmilsson. There was also Johnny Rivers, Art Garfunkel. Let's not forget he was on Steely Dan's album Pretzel Logic featuring Ricky Don't Lose That Number. And a few tracks on Alice Cooper's 1976 album Alice Cooper Goes to Hell. Gordon was one of the most prolific session drummers of the 1960s and 70s. He was known for his incredible versatility and, as mentioned, famous for playing on some of the biggest songs of those decades. He was born in Los Angeles and began drumming professionally as a teenager. He became a key figure in the Wrecking Crew group, the not-so-famous musicians who played on very famous hits. Let's revisit some of those hits. Layla with Derek and the Dominos. He was part of that band on their one and only studio album. Though he's given a co-write to Layla, there's a lot of conflicting stories that the piano coda in that song was actually written by Rita Coolidge. Then there's You're So Vain by Carly Simon. His drumming's really featured prominently on that 1972 hit that topped the charts in both the US and the UK. One of the most impressive guitar hits of all time has to be Classical Gas by Mason Williams. It's an instrumental, came out in '68, and was one of Gordon's early claims to fame. On that track, nothing but finesse drumming. As mentioned, Ricky Don't Lose That Number by Steely Dan. There was Wichita Lineman by Glenn Campbell, that famous Jimmy Webb song from '68. Again, very subtle drumming, yet essential for that ballad. It's known as one of the greatest country songs of all time. And the Albert Hammond hit from '72, It Never Rains in Southern California. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention one of the greatest post-Beatle albums of all time by any member of that band, All Things Must Pass, with George Harrison, 1970. There was a dark side to Jim Gordon's life. In the 70s, possibly as early as the 60s, he started hearing voices, most notably his mother's voice. And eventually his condition worsened. Tragically, in 1983, he took his mother's life. He was convicted and sentenced to 16 years to life, though he stayed there for the rest of his life. He passed away in prison on March 13th, 2023. Though there are conflicting stories, it seems his schizophrenia was undiagnosed at the time of the crime. Jim Gordon, one of the greatest drummers of all time, and unfortunately overshadowed by that awful crime involving his mother. Jill! So are you saying that Jill did not want to be part of this, but she wished you luck?
When I started work on the book, I reached out to Mike Post, who is Amy Gordon's godfather and Jill Gordon's closest friend. And I told him I was going to do this book, and he gave it authentic, serious consideration. But in the long run, he wasn't there. He called up and he said, I really wish you luck and everything, but no, there's no upside to this for us. So I went ahead and did the book without the talking to Mike or Jill or Amy, and then finished the manuscript, and I sent it into the publisher and took a vacation. And the first morning I was in Hawaii, the phone rings, and it's Mike Post. And he says that Jim has died, and that the family wants to put out a release to get ahead of the story, but they don't really know how to. And he suggested that I might. Well, indeed, I do, have a publicist and all that. So we put out the press release saying that Jim had died, and everything changed. Suddenly I'm on the phone with Amy Gordon, having long talks, had several detailed, lengthy interviews with Jill and Mike Post, and they all kicked in photographs, and suddenly, they were part of the project. I'm glad to say that although their interviews were excellent and informative and helpful, I had already had the story. There were no missing pieces that they could provide me with. But on the other hand, they were not in the position to know this stuff, oddly enough. What they knew about was what they lived through. But when they read the book, all three of them were blown away, kind of a life-changing type blown away. I mean, Mike Post called me. He said, I realized that I couldn't have helped Jim any more than I did. And Jill Gordon said the same thing. And to her, she was quite remote from Jim after the divorce, other than the co-parenting, which he was very, very slight on. So she didn't know about any of the torturous things of like weeding the backyard or taking down the gold records or any of that. And it absolutely blew her mind. She told me pretty much the same thing, that, she came to realize that she couldn't have helped Jim any more than she did. And of course, Amy Gordon, Jim's daughter, she was so traumatized by the death of her grandmother at age 14 and at the hands of her difficult father, that she was unable to even face it for many, many years. About 10 years ago, she started to like deal with this and arrange for a conservancy for her father and tried to visit him and sort of like started to think about this in some kind of way. So this book was incredibly important to her, and allowed her to see her father in a more holistic manner. This is
Sometimes
deep stuff. I mean, I love getting good reviews and everything, but having those three read the book and tell me that it changed their lives, that's all I need.
there's no upside to this, as Mike Posta told you. I can understand that, but he said that because you can't tell the story without all these big warts. Is that why?
I think, I mean, John, you and I can't really understand that kind of trauma. And it's certainly nothing you ever get over. It's only something you get years away from and make some kind of peace with. But if you're in that blast zone, you're walking away scarred for life. And I don't think Mike or Jill or Amy thought about that such a book and the research and the knowledge that it contained would be healing. I don't think they thought that at all. I don't think it even occurred to them. It turned out to be. And I'm in the newspaper business. I've been around traumatized people all my life and tried to get them to answer questions and always at the most vulnerable, wrong time. So I'm not inexperienced with trauma victims, and they're tender people. You have to like give them space to be themselves and try and understand their perspective on things. Pressing trauma victims has never been a successful strategy for me.
Fly in the wall aspect of the book, to me, when you started it off, I'm it's strange. I always see him. I'm up here and I'm looking at him as you're describing this guy, this quiet drummer who's not dropping names, but as I think, I don't know, I forget who you were saying. He said, "Oh, that's me playing on one of the tracks." He had heard it on the radio. one of the guys from Blue Monkeys. And the fact that
Yeah.
out of nowhere he says, "Well, I got to go. I got to go to the doctor," and he's never seen again. And then the incident happens. And how did you see him when you were describing him? Who was that guy that you were describing near the end with the Blue Monkeys?
Yeah, that opening scene is powerful in my mind too, John. It's there's some of the genesis of my interest in this came from that. Because I knew Rolly Sally in the Chris Isaac band real well. He was a good friend. And he told me long ago about playing with Jim Gordon. And I found that so interesting that, Jim Gordon was in this dump band that because he couldn't manage himself. And yeah, Rolly was sweet. Rolly sent him a bathrobe when he was in jail. You don't get to wear bathrobes in jail.
Oh my God. You know, Jeff Skunk Baxter told me, it might have been the first time I talked to him might have been about 6 months before Jim died. And he said, well, I should visit him. And the second time was just a few weeks after he died. And I said, you weren't going to visit him. I mean, you know that. I don't have to tell you anything, right? He says, oh, yeah. And then I was watching one of your interviews earlier with another guy named John, the drummer. And you had said that you sent Jim Gordon some books. And I mean, he obviously got them, but he was not the type of guy that was going to reach out to you.
He didn't like visitors.
Yeah.
He didn't want them. I don't want to say he was happy or comfortable, but Jim accepted imprisonment as his life. He didn't play drums in prison, and he'd sit in with the prison band every so often because everybody knew who he was, but he wasn't regularly on the drums. He didn't want to play drums. He didn't want to think about that part of his life. He was heavily medicated. He was, still very ill. And I think he avoided all his parole hearings. So I think Jim embraced prison as the solution for his problems. And there's a number of people who told me, that they tried to make arrangements to visit him and that he would cancel at the last minute. This also, by the way, is kind of typical of late stage schizophrenics. I mean, schizophrenics have huge problems bonding with people. It was really difficult for Jim to be a father or to be in a romantic relationship. And all the studio musicians that worked by his side, they didn't have any real personal knowledge of him. They knew him as a musician and a guy with a smile. But I'm talking to Dean Parks, 100 sessions or more with Jim, and he didn't know whether Jim was married or had kids, or they'd never had a lunch together or a drink after the sessions. But that's schizophrenics for you. They do not bond. And as they get older, they get more and more, in interior life and withdrawn. So that's what people describe Jim on the Yard is remote, by himself, not on the yard a lot. Most of his time spent in his cell. It's heartbreaking stuff. It really is.
We'll have part 2 of our series coming up with Joel Sullivan in the next few days. Make sure you comment on our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos. If you want to make a donation to the channel, there's a PayPal link. Also, join our Patreon. You'll get early access to our videos. And we have a swag store where you can buy a Rock History Music t-shirt, cap, and all kinds of different swag with our logo on it. Subscribe to our channel, share our videos, and comment on them. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take care of yourself.